That sounds good. All right, so first I'd like to thank SAMLA for existing, and thank you, Mary, for putting this panel on, and thank all of you for attending. So the paper that I'm going to be presenting for you guys today is part of a larger project that I've been working on, putting Pericles and the Tempest into a sort of contemporary conversation about neoliberal fishing practices and sort of continuing economic and ecological concerns in ocean spaces. And I'll get to that a little bit at the end of this paper. So the title of this paper, again, is Salt Fish, Fishing as Material Model for Empire Building in Pericles. This presentation, and the larger paper from which it's drawn, attempts, alongside scholars like Dan Brayton and Steve Mintz, to carve out space for an oceanic eco-criticism in the face of what Brayton terms the terrestrial bias. He argues that blue water has been a consistent blind spot for many eco-critics who focus their energies on critically going green. But as Mintz and Brayton point out, Elizabethan England was a culture deeply engaged with the sea in ways eco-critics are only starting to fully appreciate. Pericles is one of Shakespeare's most fishy plays, so it's surprising how rarely critics read the play via a blue ecological lens. In the play, the titular hero builds an empire across the eastern Mediterranean, in the process being alternately united with and separated from his wife and daughter. Rereading Pericles from an oceanic and fishy perspective provides new insights into the cultural, material, and ideological role of fish and fishing in early modern England's imperial expansion. Readings of the fishermen seen in Pericles often ignore the specifically material dimension of fishing, which provides a proto-imperial model for controlling ostensibly unoccupied spaces to extract raw materials. While critics acknowledge the social class commentary of the fisherman's allegory, they rarely note the more insidious assumptions about the ocean as an empty space to be conquered and exploited. I argue that Shakespeare evokes fishing as a culturally relevant metaphor for an English public and a burgeoning empire immersed in salt. But this imagery also shows imperialism doubling back upon itself, illustrating not only the mechanisms of imperialism, but the hybridity that inevitably results from imperial contact. Steve Mintz puts Pericles in conversation with Moby Dick and distinguishes between fast fish and loose fish. This distinction problematizes ownership in an oceanic context. To briefly sum up the difference, fast fish belong to someone, generally a nation which has established exclusive fishing rights in or over a certain area. Fast fish become part of a nation's wealth, and for a boat from another nation to take them is a form of theft. By contrast, loose fish exist in a kind of first-come, first-served system where no nation or group has legally established rights to them. Issues of control or freedom of the seas were crucial to England's economic and imperial future in the early modern period because a significant amount of new wealth was brought to the nation through trade in dried fish from the Canadian coast. Early colonial expansion into Canadian waters took place amidst legal debates about the freedom of the seas, with thinkers lining up either in favor of open oceans or of nationally owned waters. As nations like England and the Dutch Republic began expanding their maritime interests, their goals conflicted with the Treaty of Tordesillas signed in 1494, which divided the world into halves owned by Spain and Portugal. Now, English and Dutch politicians, legal theorists, and merchants discussed Spanish and Portuguese claims during this period. Sorry, I lost my place for a second.
Sorry.
English and Dutch politicians, legal theorists, and merchants discussed Spanish and Portuguese claims during this era, and whether or not Northern Europeans looking to build new empires were bound to obey these claims. According to Mintz, Hugo Grotius's Mare Liberum attacked the Portuguese monopoly of the East Indies trade. Grotius's brief articulated in legal terms the increasingly powerful cultural fantasy of oceanic liberty, but his ocean of loose fish did not go unchallenged. English jurist John Selden's Mare Clausum forcefully argued for legal fastness. These debates took place within a very specific colonialist context, issues over the rights to resources. Those who favored a loose ocean supported a blue water free market, while those arguing for a fast ocean wanted to protect national claims. This means that as Shakespeare staged plays about empires establishing control over oceans, he did so contemporaneously with serious legal, economic, and philosophical debates about how, if at all, these seas could or should be controlled by and for national interests. I argue that plays like Pericles show Shakespeare's awareness of this early colonial context, whether or not the bard specifically followed the debates on oceanic liberty. In Pericles, the hero moves through the eastern Mediterranean, establishing political links and relationships, and eventually gaining control over the entire region. By the conclusion of the play, Pericles rules much of what had been the Athenian Empire in the latter half of the 5th century BCE. The cities under his control include at least Pericles' own kingdom of Tyre, his wife's kingdom of Pentapolis, Tarsus, and the city of Mytilene brought to the empire through his daughter Marina's marriage. Prior to Pericles' arrival, each of these city-states had been independent, a kind of loose fish with political freedom, but through Pericles' empire building, they've been brought under one crown, presumably a positive unification rewarding Pericles and his family for their moral uprightness. As the play's choric narrator John Gower concludes, in Pericles his queen and daughters seen, although assailed with fortune fierce and keen, virtue preserved from fell destruction's blast, led on by heaven and crowned with joy at last. The play tacitly endorses this fast fish project of empire by identifying moral goodness with the construction of empires. And it's particularly through the imagery of fishing that this imperial project is presented in Pericles. Pericles probably has more distinct representation of fishermen and a fishing consciousness than any other play in Shakespeare's canon. And as Steve Mentz explains, fishing for empire appears most clearly in an earlier sea play, Pericles, in which the hero learns philosophy from fishermen and his daughter emerges from the deep. These two instances, Pericles' interaction with the fishermen and Marina's birth from the ocean, mark a consciousness of fishing not only as a metaphor for empire, but as the actual material condition grounding expansion across the waters. One must catch an empire, but to do that one must fish, both literally and figuratively. Now the fishermen in Pericles are common people from whom the titular character gains both wisdom and an authority to rule. Apart from being a comic relief scene, the fishermen play a crucial function in the development of Pericles as an imperial leader because they show him that, as Mentz puts it, life in the water reflects life on land. The scene solidifies for Pericles the notion of empire because the fishermen remind Pericles that it is the way of the world for creatures higher up the great chain of being to consume lower creatures. It's a short extension of this premise to a justification for conquest, as the best states may be justified through a reified rhetoric of natural order in their fastening of loose fish independent states. The third fisherman says, "Master, I marvel how the fishes live in the sea." To which the master replies allegorically, "Why, as men do a land, the great ones eat up the little ones. I can compare our rich misers to nothing so fitly as to a whale, a plays and tumbles driving the poor fry before him, and at last devours them all at a mouthful." Although the scene is satirical, and it probably gave the groundlings a good laugh at the image of their landlords as bloated whales, it also naturalizes the idea of conquest and domination through consumption. Rather than making empire building an ethical choice, one which Pericles and early modern England could choose not to make, this allegory presents nature based on conquest and consumption. And of course the metaphor also naturalizes the role of the fishermen, who similarly scoop up the poor fry to devour them. The fact that these honest fishermen, as Pericles calls them twice, pull fish from the sea, thereby fastening the fish, shows Pericles the honesty involved in empire building because, although they may not immediately recognize the irony of it, the fishermen also behave like the bloated whales consuming poor fry. Though unlike the metaphorical fry or people, the fishermen are consuming literal fish here. But beyond providing a metaphor that reifies imperial dominance through natural imagery, The fishermen provide Pericles with the actual material tools required to begin building his overseas empire. The fishermen play an oddly democratic role, drawing our attention to the common people through whose labor empires are built. In what seems a really unlikely feat, considering that dense metal would actually sink rather than sort of drifting toward shore, the fishermen pull Pericles' armor from the ocean and return it to him after a shipwreck. After regaining his armor, Pericles can participate in the tournament for the love of Thaisa, which eventually brings him control over Pentapolis. Without his armor, Pericles could not have joined the jousting, and therefore could not have won the love of the princess, and later joined her father's kingdom with his expanding empire. Naturally, the fishermen are quick to point out the debt that Pericles owes them for the return of his armor. As the second fisherman tells him, "Ay, but hark you, my friend, 'twas we that made up this garment through the rough seams of the waters. I hope, sir, if you thrive, you'll remember from whence you had this." The second fisherman points us to the centrality of common people's labor in establishing kingdoms. And this is the second piece of wisdom that Pericles gains from his encounter with the fishermen, a reminder that the foundation of empire rests on the common people who form the basis for his throne. We may say that Pericles does in fact recall the labor of the fishermen, and that he remains faithful to his vow to remember the fisherman's role in his fortune. Although he remains a noble throughout the play, Pericles is not afraid to work like a common sailor when the storms at sea call for his action, thereby acknowledging the toil of his subjects by participating in it himself. And while it may be tempting to draw a distinction between fishing and colonialism, I argue that Pericles' and early modern England's fleets of fishermen were precisely a kind of imperial force dominating and colonizing ocean spaces. English explorers sought areas with large supplies of the fish consumed by religious and legal statute in Europe, and these searches for fish inadvertently brought Europeans into contact with lands they would later colonize. Brayton explains how the fishing industry pushed European sailors further and further from Europe's coastal waters in search of their finned prey, writing, "The international herring fishery that developed in the late Middle Ages motivated the voyages of early modern European navigators more than any concern for discovering a new world. Investors and mariners strove to develop the fisheries that were so lucrative in European markets." And Edward Test describes a colonial system in Newfoundland that he calls trade without settlement. Really fascinating article. Test writes, "Newfoundland became a new economic model for England, a foreign space temporarily housing a mobile labor force, employed wage earners who produced salt-dried cod in the New World for trade in the Old World. The Newfoundland colony had a long pre-colonial history as an economic space, an unsettled settlement that was maintained specifically for the trade in porjon." This massive consumption of New World fish not only fed Europeans, but it transcorporeally refigured them as literally composed of the spoils of empire. I'm really glad I got through transcorporeally without messing it up. Dan Brayton argues that Shakespeare conceptualizes human beings as constituted by the fish that we eat, and we can trace this line of oceanic anti-imperialism through the bard and through Pericles specifically. Brayton explains, "Fish is not merely a metaphorical presence in the writings of Shakespeare. It is a floating signifier for materiality. The insight that the human body is materially of this world, including the sea in all its strangeness, and not hovering above, destabilizes traditional conceptions of nature and human nature. This chain of reasoning, that the human is bodily constituted of and through the material world, suggests a loop by which the economic exploitation of blue water and the consumption of ocean resources literally reconstitutes the human as salty. We absorb fish and so become part of an oceanic food chain, both inserting ourselves into new natural spaces and bringing a new natural resource into our own bodies. The duality or circularity or flux of these relations disrupts a simple colonialist mindset because the results of human imperialism are reflected back and reconstituted in the human itself. The most obvious visible symbol of this salty hybridity in Pericles is the hero's daughter, Marina, whose name directly evokes her oceanic nature. Pericles makes this allegorical connection explicit when he explains, "My gentle babe Marina, whom for she was born at sea, I have named so." Born on a ship during a sea storm, Marina emerges into a chaotic ocean world, a world that seems to reject all notions of control and therefore of imperial power. As Marina herself reflects, she was born in a tempest when my mother died. This world to me is but a ceaseless storm. And indeed, the fortunes of Pericles and his family suffer constant sea changes, with first his wife being thought dead and buried at sea, then returning to life, then Marina being kidnapped by pirates and escaping, and Pericles wandering the seas in alternately triumph and despair. Marina's life in particular seems tied to the ocean, and she's most comfortable either aboard a ship or in her foster home by the sea in Tarsus. Mentz writes, Marina represents the most sea-drenched character in all of Shakespeare's plays. Neither sailor nor fish, Marina is nonetheless nearer home at sea than anywhere else. This nearness to the sea results from Marina's oceanic hybridity. She is both of the land and of the ocean, more radically so than any other character in Shakespeare, even perhaps the fishy Caliban. This hybridity is neither accidental nor incidental, but results from Pericles' colonial project of claiming imperial control over the waters. In return, his daughter is reconstituted as a hybrid both blue and green. Pericles' fishy consumption, both the literal eating of fish and the consumption of fishy spaces, hybridizes him, but Marina is born into this hybridity. And the stakes of this hybridity and of oceanic colonialism extend beyond just reading Pericles, presenting significant lessons for contemporary relations with the sea and the fishing industry. Scientists and ocean researchers are extremely concerned about the long-term and probably, or possibly, hopefully possibly rather than probably, irreversible effects of massive overfishing and pollution in the oceans. Patricia Yeager coined the term eco-criticisms, and this is eco-criticism with a $sign at the end, which doesn't really work verbally, but I can see it on the page. So eco-criticism, $sign. To draw our attention back to the way in which our view and treatment of the ocean is mediated, inflected, and refracted by capitalism and a free market ethos. She cites a number of studies that have charted decreasing catches or that tie sustained fish production to the increasingly brutal infrastructure of what Yeager terms the techno-ocean, an oceanic industry where fishing is done largely through processes like trawling and bottom dragging, which destroy vast swathes of underwater environments where fish, crustaceans, and other marine animals had once lived, sheltered, and reproduced. Overfishing combines with the increasing density of non-biodegradable trash clogging the oceans. And while the massive Pacific Ocean garbage patch may be the most visible sign of humanity's impact on the oceans, perhaps more insidious are the microplastics that are, in Yeager's words, as ordinary as plankton in the techno-ocean. Salt water, sunlight, sands, and swirling currents combine to break down large plastic items, which fragment into microplastics rather than biodegrading. These polymers mix in with the food sources for marine animals, which consume the plastic molecules in increasing quantities. The plastic products of the land enter oceanic spaces, enter the bodies of marine animals, and establish a hard plastic core of the human world within these oceanic spaces. But the ocean also returns the results of our environmental colonialism. By simultaneously dumping waste into the oceans and extracting fish from them, we re-encounter the chemicals and plastics in the bodies of the sea creatures we harvest for consumption. Through fish consumption, we ingest the wastes we've attempted to rid ourselves of by casting them into the sea. The eaten fish, and therefore the plastics, chemicals, and heavy metals they've ingested, literally recompose us as seafood-eating subjects, hybridizing us just as Pericles and Marina are hybridized. Thank you.